You ever love someone who ruined you and still called it the best years of your life? Don't answer that out loud. Just sit with it for a second, because that's the whole movie. That's the entire 2 hours of Interview with a Vampire compressed into one sentence. And it's why this film has been quietly wrecking people since 1994, while everybody else was busy laughing at Tom Cruise's wig. Here's the part that nobody warns you about going in. This isn't a horror movie about fangs. It's a hostage tape wearing a horror movie's clothes. Brad Pitt sits in a chair for 2 hours and narrates the story of the man who took apart his entire sense of self, piece by piece. And the whole time he's telling it like a tragic romance. And the genuinely disturbing part is that he's not lying to you. It really does play like a love story. That's the diagnosis before we even open the file. Louis isn't wounded by a monster. He's wounded by a relationship. And those two things heal on completely different timelines if they heal at all. So here's the plan for the entire video. We're pulling the full case file on this house. Lestat first, obviously, because Lestat is the reason half of you are still awake at 3 a.m. thinking about cheekbones instead of sleeping like normal people. But we're also doing Louis, who's not nearly as innocent as his own narration wants you to believe. Claudia, who I'd argue is one of the quietest, most devastating character studies ever put in a vampire film. And Armand, who runs a full operation out of Paris theater basement that nobody calls it as it actually is. 4 vampires, one house, 4 completely ways of being dangerous. Get comfortable because we're not rushing this one. Before diagnosis, the file has to be straight because this movie gets flattened online into hot vampires fight people content, and that does the material a real disservice. Anne Rice wrote the source novel in 1976. There's a widely reported detail that she wrote it in the aftermath of losing her young daughter to leukemia. And whether or not you know that walking in, grief soaks through every page of this story regardless. The film adaptation came out in 1994, directed by Neil Jordan, and the road to get it made took nearly 2 decades from the book's release. Casting alone almost sank the project before a single scene got shot. Rice originally wanted Daniel Day-Lewis for Lestat. Reports say he read the script and turned it down, reportedly because he didn't love the idea of essentially living in a coffin for months the way he committed to a wheelchair for his last role. Jordan eventually casted Tom Cruise instead, and Rice was furious about it publicly before production even wrapped. She took out ads voicing her displeasure. Then she saw the finished film and did a full public reversal, praising Cruise's performance. That reversal matters because it tells you something about what Cruise actually built here. He didn't play Lestat as a monster in a cape doing vampire things. He played them quieter and more unsettlingly, a man who's enjoying himself. Here's the setup for anyone who needs a refresher. Louis de Pointe du Lac is an 18th century plantation owner in New Orleans, grieving the deaths of his wife and infant child, wandering the city looking for a way to stop existing without the indignity of doing it himself. Lestat de Lioncourt finds him in exactly that state of collapse and makes him an offer most people wouldn't recognize as a trap until decades in. Immortality, I'll take it. An exit from grief, a way to stop being human than actual death. Louis says yes, and the second he does, Lestat sinks his teeth into his neck and the contract is signed in blood, no paperwork required or chance to read the fine print. I will take that for immortality. What follows is roughly 200 years of Louis narrating that decision to a journalist named Daniel Malloy in a hotel room. And somewhere in the middle of that timeline, the two of them take in a 5-year-old girl named Claudia, turn her into a vampire, and raise her as a daughter for 30 straight years, while her body stays frozen as a child the entire time. Eventually, the three of them cross the Atlantic and land in Paris, where they meet Armand, who runs a coven operating out of a working theater, performing shows for a paying human audience that are, in reality, live executions dressed up as art. One more piece of the file before we move on, because it changes how you should watch everything that follows. The whole story is told in flashback from inside a hotel room, decades after most of the events happen. Louis is confessing to a total stranger with a tape recorder running, and he never once asked Daniel to keep any of it quiet. He wants this on record. The man who's genuinely at peace with his own past doesn't need a stranger with a microphone to sit through 200 years of it in one sitting. That's a confession looking for absolution, not a memoir looking for accuracy. And it's worth holding on to that distinction for everything ahead, because it means every version of these events you're about to hear is Louis' version, filtered through whatever he needs to believe about himself to keep functioning. That's the intake. 4 vampires under one roof, and every single one of them is running a completely different psychological profile underneath the same things. Let's get into the symptoms. Lestat de Lioncourt. We start with the obvious one because Lestat is the character everybody remembers, and almost nobody actually breaks down past he's evil and he's hot. I think that's a lazy read of one of the most carefully constructed predators in vampire fiction. So let's actually look what he does. The first move Lestat makes after turning Louis is refusing to explain a single rule of this new existence. He won't say how feeding actually works, won't say what Louis is now capable of, won't handle any other piece of information that would let operate with real independence. Instead, the information gets dangled like a leash, doled out in scraps whenever it suits Lestat's mood. Louis spends his entire nights as a vampire completely dependent on a man who enjoys keeping him that way. An act of independency isn't an accident in the writing, it's a deliberate structure. Keep somebody reliant on you for the basics of functioning, and you never have to worry about losing them. Because functioning without you simply isn't an option they've been given. Then there's the emotional whiplash that runs through the entire relationship. One night, Lestat is playful, magnetic, practically giddy, dragging Louis out on the hunt like two friends on the town. The next night, he turns cold, mocking Louis's guilt, calling his conscience soft and embarrassing. This inconsistency is doing real work on Louis's brain. Idealize somebody, then devalue them, then swing back to idealizing them again. And you create an attachment that's stickier than plain cruelty ever could produce on its own. Because the human nervous system doesn't file unpredictable, but occasionally wonderful the same way it files reliably bad. It files it as something worth chasing, something worth staying close to just in case the good version comes back. That's how man ends up 2 centuries deep into a relationship and still narrating using the language of romance instead of the language of horror. And you think being a vampire and being centuries old, you'll be immune to narcissism, right? I guess not. Watch what Lestat does with Louis's guilt specifically, because this is where his profile gets genuinely dark. Louis feels sick after every kill. He wants to feed on animals instead of people. He wants some thread of immoral line standing between himself and what he's becoming. Lestat's response every single time is contempt. He tells Louis his guilt is childish, that morality is human weakness that he needs to shut. On the surface, that reads as simple cruelty. Underneath it, it's a man actively dismantling somebody else's conscience, piece by piece, because the conscience is the one internal structure standing between Louis and full compliance. Take the guilt away, and Louis stops being a partner in this arrangement. He becomes a tool that no longer resists being used. There is a specific scene early on worth slowing all the way down for, the one where Lestat forces Louis to feed on a rat because Louis is still refusing to take a human life. Watch what actually is happening underneath the surface of that scene. Lestat isn't teaching Louis anything useful about survival. He already knows Louis can survive on animals if he wants to. Other vampires in this mythology do it for stretches at a time. What Lestat is actually doing is humiliating him publicly, making him choke down something disgusting in front of an audience of one, and framing the whole thing as tough love, as a necessary instruction, as Lestat simply being the experienced mentor here to toughen up the new guy. That reframing is the entire trick. Cruelty gets rebranded as guidance often enough that the person on the receiving end starts thanking them for the lesson instead of naming what actually happened to them. Then Claudia enters the picture, and Lestat whole profile deepens into something worse. Louis, in a moment of complete collapse, feeds on a dying child during a plague outbreak and flees the scene in horror of what he's done. Lestat's response was to finish the job. I don't remember how old she was. Was she 5, 10? So he turns her into a vampire and presents her to Louis like a gift, like comfort or something that meant to ease Louis's shame. Sit with what that actually is for a second. Louis' single worst moment, the one thing he's most ashamed of in his entire existence, gets converted by Lestat into a permanent fixture of their household. That's not comfort at all. That's leverage wearing comfort's face, and Lestat uses Claudia for the rest of the film as an anchor to keep Louis tethered to the house, because a man might eventually walk away from a partner he no longer trusts. But walking away from a child is a much harder thing to live with. The charm is the whole engine underneath this. And Cruz plays Lestat, who's fun to be around when he wants to be. And that's the point of the performance. Nobody stays trapped by a person who's cruel every single second of every single day. People stay trapped by somebody who's magnetic, who often enough the cruelty feels like the entry fee for the magnetism. That's the actual mechanism behind a huge percentage of relationships outside of observers can't understand from a distance. The question was never, why does she stay with somebody that mean? The real question is, why does she stay with somebody that mean, but also some nights the best time she's ever had in her life? Completely different question, and a much, much harder one to walk away from once it's rooted. One more symptom worth flagging before we move on. Lestat never actually kills Louis for defying him, and that restraint matters clinically. A person running on pure rage doesn't need control, he just needs domination. Lestat wants domination that lasts, so he keeps Louis alive and useful and keeps him close enough to keep manipulating for centuries rather than snapping his neck the first time Louis talks back. That's patience in service of control, which is honestly scarier than temper ever could be. Here's what something that gets skipped constantly in casual takes on this film. Lestat isn't only running it on Louis. In a wider race universe, he turns his own dying mother, Gabrielle, into a vampire as well, desperate to keep her from slipping away from him the same way everybody eventually does. That's the same hunger showing up twice with two different people. Lestat doesn't actually want power for his own sake the way a sociopath would. He wants family that can't leave. He builds himself a version of a household out of people he's turned, because turning somebody is the only kind of intimacy he sees capable of trusting, one where the other person is permanently bound and can't simply walk out the door one morning. That's not romantic, even though the film photographs it beautifully. That's somebody so afraid of abandonment, he's willing to trap people in eternal life just to guarantee they stay. Then there's the resurrection scene, and if you've seen the film, you know exactly which one I mean. Claudia's attempt on Lestat's life fails, technically, and he crawls back into the house half destroyed, barely holding a body together, and sits down at the piano anyway to play, even betrayed by the two people he built his whole fractured family out of. He performs and still needs an audience. That single image tells you more about Lestat's core wound than three separate monologues could manage. Somewhere underneath 300 years of control and cruelty is a man who can't tolerate being unseen. And everything else, the manipulation, charm, cruelty, all of it might just be the elaborate architecture built around one very simple and human terror of being forgotten. Quick aside, because I know somebody's going to bring it up in the comments anyway. Yes, people spend an entire year mad about the wig. Yes, the discourse around Cruz playing Lestat got so loud, and Rice took out newspaper ads about it before the film even released. And yeah, all of that noise ended up being about literally the least important thing about the performance. Everybody was arguing about hair, while Cruz was building an accurate on screen of a charismatic controller that decade of cinema produced. Sometimes the internet argues about the wig, so it doesn't have to sit with what the characters actually are doing. That's not a vampire problem. That's a people problem. And we see it every single week in this house. Worth noting that Lestat had a human life before any of this, a minor French nobleman with an overbearing father and very little say over his own future. By most accounts of the wider Rice mythology, that backstory doesn't excuse a single thing he does across 2 centuries as a vampire, but it does complete the picture. A man raised with no real power over his own life grows up to become somebody who needs absolute power over everybody else's. That's not a plot twist. That's just how this particular wound tends to travel from one generation into the next when nobody ever stops it. Louis de Pointe du Lac. Now, here's the part in this film that is kind of unsettling. And I say that who sat with this movie more times than probably healthy for a working psychologist to admit. Louis isn't innocent. I need that stated plainly because the film phrased him as the wronged party narrating his own abuse to a journalist. And he's really a victim of what Lestat did to him early on. That part is real. And I'm not like saying it isn't. The 2 centuries feeding on human beings stops being purely someone else's fault along the timeline. The guilt Louis carries like a badge of honor starts to look less like an act of conscience and more like a performance of one, a way of feeling like the good vampire in the house without actually changing a single behavior underneath the performance. Pay attention to how Louis narrates his own story to Daniel across this entire film. Every kill gets framed as something happened to him, than something he chose to do. Lestat made me. Lestat forced my hand, even decades in, long after his endless chances to leave, to starve himself out or end the whole arrangement. He's still telling the story like a man with zero agency of his own. That pattern shows up constantly in survivors of long term control, where the identity of being the one who is done to becomes far safer to hold on to than the harder, messier truth that at some point a person starts participating in their own captivity. There's also something worth naming honestly about how Louis handles Claudia across these 30 years. He loves her genuinely, no argument there. But he also uses her the exact same way Lestat uses him, just with a gentler hand doing it. Louis needs Claudia to need him. Her dependency gives him a role to organize himself around, a purpose that lets him avoid ever having to sit with 2 centuries of unresolved guilt on his own. When Claudia eventually turns on his Lestat, plots against him, moves to end him for good, Louis doesn't stop her. He watches and helps in the moment it counts. The uglier read here isn't only self-preservation. Well, it is a part of it. Some part of him clearly wanted this outcome and wanted to keep his own hands looking clean while it happened, letting a child do the violence he never admit to wanting himself. This is a quieter kind of villainy than Lestat's, and in some ways it's far more relatable one, which is why exactly it deserves attention than a passing mention. Look at what Louis actually does to Daniel Malloy by the end of the film, too. Because it's easy to forget he does anything to him at all when you're this deep into the story. He spends 200 years learning exactly how seduction into this life feels, and learning the entire dance of the offer, and learning what a grieving, exhausted person needs to hear before they say yes to something they shouldn't. Then, once the tape runs out and Daniel says the story didn't scare him, didn't warn him off, only made him want it more, Louis reacts with genuinely fury. He's furious that his confession got heard as an invitation instead of a warning. But notice what he does with that fury. He doesn't destroy the tapes or stop Daniel from leaving with the recording still playing his own worst moments out loud into the world. Some part of him wanted exactly this outcome and wanted someone to hear the whole thing and still want in, because being the reason somebody else says yes is the closest thing to Lestat's old audience he's ever let himself want for his own. 200 years insisting he hates what he is, and in the very end, he becomes, for one night, the very thing he spent the whole tape condemning. Quick note before we move to Claudia properly, because Madeline's character is worth naming, even briefly. Louis and Claudia find her grieving her own dead daughter in Paris, and Claudia insists Louis turn her, so Claudia can have a mother figure who won't abandon her the way every other adult eventually does. Louis does it against his own better judgment, and it goes about his as badly as everything Louis agrees to against his better judgment. Madeline gets caught up in the fallout of Claudia's plot against Lestat and pays for a decision that was never fully hers to begin with. It's a small moment in the runtime, but it's a perfect miniature of the whole film's thesis. Everybody in this house keeps making irreversible decisions on behalf of people who never got a real vote. Claudia, I want to move carefully here because more than anybody else in this house, Claudia is a child who turned against her will by 2 adults and then spent 30 years watching those same 2 adults compete over who loved her more without either of them ever asking what she actually needed from either of them. That context matters, and I'm not going to skip past it. But her arc has a genuinely dark undercurrent, worth naming clearly, because it's one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in the entire film. Claudia develops a fully adult mind trapped permanently inside a child that won't change again. The rage that builds in her across decades isn't irrational or isn't a character flaw either. It's the completely predictable outcome of being denied the one thing that every developing person requires, which is for the outside of their body to eventually catch up with what's happening on the inside. She watches Lestat and Louis continue changing in personality and experience while she stays frozen in place, doll-like, permanently a child in every room she enters. The resentment that builds from that isn't pathology. It's exactly what happens to any person kept in a rested state by people who insist constantly that they only did it out of love. Where the character turns genuinely chilling is the plan she builds to end the stat. She's patient about it and precise. She poisons him carefully, has Louis help finish the job by cutting his throat, dumps his body in the swamp, and does the entire thing with the calm of somebody who's clearly rehearsed every step in her head before executing it. That's not a tantrum from an upset little girl. That's premeditation from a mind with decades of planning hidden behind the face of somebody the world keeps mistaking for harmless. It's one of the only moments in this whole film that shows you plainly exactly how dangerous it is to underestimate a person just because their body doesn't match their capability. There's a scene worth slowing down on here. The one where Claudia stares into a mirror and realizes fully what's actually been done to her. She spends decades dressed as a doll by two men who kept insisting the arrangement was love. And the mirror is the moment where the performance cracks. She isn't looking as a child in that reflection. She's looking at a fully formed adult mind wearing a costume she never agreed to keep wearing. And that gap between what she sees and what everybody else insists on treating her as is the exact gap trauma lives in. It's not usually the event itself that does the most lasting damage. It's the years spent afterwards being told your own perception of what happened to you doesn't match the official story that everybody around you has agreed to tell. Her relationship with dolls throughout the film deserves a second look too. It's not because a cute visual, it's something closer to a coping mechanism. She surrounds herself with literal dolls, objects frozen exactly the state she's frozen in. And at some point, that stops reading as a child's innocent habit and starts reading as a woman surrounding herself with mirrors of her own condition, objects that can't grow either, and that never asked to be let out. I don't know if this was deliberate or intentional, but it lands as one of the most quietly upsetting visual choices in the entire film, precisely because nobody in the story ever comments on it. They just let her keep collecting them, the same way they let her stay small in every other way that actually mattered. By the time she plans Lestat's death, she's not acting out of childish spite like Lestat frames it. She's executing the only power move available to somebody who's been denied every other kind of power for 30 straight years. Take away somebody's ability to grow and to leave or be believed, anything. And the only leverage that leaves standing is that nobody sees coming until it happened. Quick follow to Armand, because he doesn't get credit how unsettling his operation actually is once you see it clearly. He runs a coven that hunts in plain sight by staging plays where the victim on stage is a real human being, murdered live in front of the paying audience who genuinely believe they're watching theater than an execution. Underneath this spectacle sits an entire belief system built around performance and hierarchy, And the idea of the oldest vampires in the room get to decide who's permitted to exist in their world and under what terms. Armand offers Louis belonging and the almost shape that Lestat once offered him escape, and Louis nearly falls for it in the exact same way, which tells you something important about how a person shaped by one controlling relationship will often walk straight right to the next one because it's wearing a different face and speaking a gentler tone of voice. There's a specific detail worth sitting with too. Armand doesn't recruit through fear the way you expect running an execution ring would. He recruits through intention and listens to Louis that nobody bothered in decades, mirror his grief back at him, and makes him feel seen for the first time since Lestat. That's the oldest move in the book for anyone building a following. And it works on Louis precisely because Lestat spent so many decades starving him exactly that kind of attention. Scarcity creates hunger, and Armand simply shows up with a full plate at the exact moment Louis is starving. Every coercive group works this way. Find the person who's been isolated long enough to be grateful for basic decency, then convince them that basic decency was actually devotion. The theater itself deserves a mention too, because Santiago and the rest of the troupe treat murder as art with total sincerity, applauding themselves for their own cruelty like it's a craft to be perfected. That's the part of Armand's world that should generally disturb you more than any single kill. An entire community built around normalizing violence by addressing it and culture and ritual so that anybody who inside it stops experiencing what they're doing as harm at all. It just becomes Tuesday and it becomes the show. Here's the file laid out plain, all four of them side by side. Lestat presents as a case clinicians with likely recognized as malignant narcissism, layered with genuine antisocial traits underneath. There is no real guilt over harm caused, a genuine hunger for control dressed up convincingly as mentorship, and a talent for charm that isn't fake, simply deployed with precision. He isn't chaotic at all. He's calculated, and he's having a wonderful time being calculated about it. Louis is a study in prolonged trauma bonding, the kind where a person stays attached to their harmer long past any point worth staying makes sense because the relationship became the entire architecture of his identity before he ever gotten the chance to build one independently. His guilt is real, but over 2 centuries, it's also become a comfortable way of avoiding the harder work of genuine change. Claudia shows you what happens when arrested development gets forced onto somebody by adults insisting it's for her own good. Her rage isn't pathology at all, it's a single sanest response in the entire film, and almost nobody gives her enough credit for that. The coldness with she has is what happens when patience and fury get decades to sit inside the same body together, waiting. Armand runs coercive control at an institutional scale, using belonging and hierarchy in nearly the same shapeless dot you use with dependency, just a better costume and better lighting design. Four completely different profiles under one roof, and every single one proves the exact same point by the end. The scariest thing in this entire film is never the fangs. It was how ordinary, how all of it looked from the inside while it was actively happening to the people living through it. Here's the piece that ties the whole file together. So pay attention to this part especially. Every single relationship in this movie runs on the same underlying currency that somebody's survival is either literal or emotional. It depends entirely of staying close to the person harming them. Louis needs Lestat to teach him how to exist, as what he's become. Claudia needs both men just to have anybody in her life at all. Louis later needs Armand for the exact same reason he once needed Lestat: belonging, structure, somebody older who seems to have the answers. Strip away the fangs and the immortality and the candlelit New Orleans mansion, and what you're actually watching is a documentary about how control gets built, maintained, and passed down between people who all insist sincerely that what they're doing is love. Nobody in this house is lying when they say that. That's what makes it so much worse if they were. It also explains why this film keeps getting rediscovered by new audiences every few years, long after the initial wave of 90s vampire content moved on, like the new series that I haven't seen. If you've seen it and liked it, please tell me. Most vampire stories are really about death. This one is really about what it costs to a person that stays in a relationship that reshapes their entire identity about somebody else's needs. And that's a story that doesn't need fangs to land. It just happens to be wearing them. One last thing before we close the file, because it's worth noting that this story didn't stop mattering to people after 1994. Rice kept writing this world for decades afterward, and the mythology eventually made its way into television, with a newer series continuing these dynamics for a new audience. That tells you something how sturdy the underlying psychology actually is, underneath the period costumes and the candlelight. You could move the story to a new decade, cast entirely different actors, update every visual choice on screen, and the core mechanics still land because control, dependency, and the slow erosion of somebody's sense of self don't go out of style. They just get new lighting. Red scale. The stat sits at a 9 out of 10, charming enough to survive 3 centuries of people who genuinely should have seen the whole thing coming from a mile away, and confident enough that even half the decomposed piano, you still assume you'd still want to hear him play. Honestly, the most terrifying part was that he was right, and that he usually is. Louis lands out of 6 out of 10, mostly dangerous to himself and to anybody who mistakes 200 years of guilt for 200 years of actual growth. Give this man a journal instead of a journalist next time, and maybe we don't need 3 separate men to raise one vampire child. Claudia deserves an 8 out of 10. Underestimate her once, and there won't be a second chance for you to correct that mistake. She waited 30 years and planned it better than most adults plan a dinner party. Respect the patience even while you're packing slowly out of the room. Armand clocks out of a 7 out of 10, a cult leader with considerably better set design than most cult leaders ever bother putting together, running his whole operation on the same tired trick every group has used. Find somebody starving for attention and tell them the intention was always devotion. Add it up, and this house scores higher collectively than most slasher franchises manage across 5 sequels, and not one of them needed a knife to do it. That's the whole diagnosis right there. The most dangerous thing in this film, in this movie, isn't the bite. It was always what came after. The decades of somebody convincing you that the fight was love. If you've ever been in a narcissistic relationship, you'll know what I'm talking about. Thank you for being here. And if you liked watching this, watch this after. Oh, wait, or is this? This?